as the government continued to retire its debt, it got more and more expensive to issue these notes, and the currency supply shrinks. Now, you should know, the last decades of the 19th century were periods of rapid growth, population and per capita wealth growth in the United States. So this is not normally going to be associated with a fall in the demand for currency, but the supply, look at it. By 1890, there's less than half as much currency in the country as there was in 1880. In a growing economy. This is not good. The other thing you notice in this, there's no adjustment in the seasons. There's no seasonal pattern. Now, back then, a lot more currency was needed in the harvest season than any other time of year. Because of the itinerant workers picking the crops, they needed to be paid in cash. They didn't keep bank accounts, right? They keep moving from farm to farm, right? So you would want a currency supply that varied seasonally, peaking in the autumn, and then also you would want it to grow as the country grows. But in the national banking system, there was none of that capacity. Instead, the supply is shrinking secularly with no seasonal adaptability. Oh, but look at this other line. That's the right scale. The Canadian economy was about 1/10 as big as us in GDP terms. So naturally, the currency supply total amounts are smaller. But look at the pattern of adjustment. First of all, you see there's secular growth. That looks good. Second of all, you see the seasonal sawtooth patterns. Perfect, right? Right? Accommodating the harvest. This is a free banking system. There's no central bank. There's no management. In the supply of currency, which is the biggest component of the money supply in those days, perfect adjustment. Who's planning it? Who's doing it? Nothing. Competition's doing it. Well, guess what? Which country had the crises? Which country had periodic crises with severe shortages of currency and panics, and which one didn't? Anyone want to guess?
United States.
We had one crisis after another. The Canadian system had none. Even our private clearinghouses issued emergency currency to try to make up for the shortage of the official stuff doing it quasi-legally. Well, we have all these crises, and I won't tell you the whole terrible story about why we didn't then implement a system like the Canadian system. It was tried. 12 bills through Congress between 1893 and 1907. Give us asset currency, that is currency backed by general assets. Get rid of these bond backing requirements. Civil War dinosaurs to finance a war. It's been over for decades. What do you need this for, right? Give us a Canadian system with branching nationwide so we have efficient note clearing and exchange and an automatic sopping up of excess currency after the harvest. Couldn't do it. Couldn't do it. Opposition from the established unit bankers, the New York, Wall Street interests who wanted a system that would cater to them. And guess what? They got it. They got the Fed. And that's basically the story, and of course you all know what a good job the Fed did in managing the supply of money in its first few years. Well, this is a slide from the Depression, of course, but don't get me wrong. In that period, the Fed screwed up by letting the money supply collapse twice, by the way, first in the early 30s, then in the later 30s. But before they'd done that, they caused the worst inflation in modern history in the US. Worse than the 70s. Do you know that the inflation rate was between 15 and 20%, and in some months 25% for all of the period 1916 through 1920? The first years of the Fed's existence, it got off to a start. But now, of course, since the Depression, they figured out how to manage things and we don't have crises anymore. So that's the happy ending of my story. I think I've talked just about as much as I should, except there are a few things I want to tell you about free banking that I haven't been able to say. There are a few things that people must understand about it that I want to straighten out. Free banking is not a panacea. It doesn't solve every problem. You won't have a perfect money supply with free banking. You won't have a system where banks don't fail and people don't lose money. That's how the market works. Indeed, I have to go further and say a free banking system is only as good as the base money that it's based on. We talked about the historical free banking systems based on gold. Well, the gold supply didn't always behave ideally, but it must be said that that natural monetary base behaved a lot better on the whole in systems where it was combined with free banking than our fiat-based money has behaved, which has been just completely cuckoo sometimes, right? Now, you don't need to have gold or silver to have free banking. We could have free banking today on the basis of Federal Reserve dollars, right? We just let the banks issue notes, get rid of bad regulations, get rid of deposit insurance and government guarantees if you can figure out how, right? Because you can't have those and have a well-working system. And you can have that with the base of fiat dollars. You can have that. But then, of course, you would still have to ask, who's going to control the quantity of that base? And the answer would be, if it's the Fed and they can do whatever they want with it, we're not going to be much better off, even though a banking system is in some respects sounder. So there are real limits to what you can get out of banking reform in the way of a well-performing monetary system if you don't have a gold standard to base it. You still would have to reform the suppliers of the fiat underlying base money somehow. Otherwise, they're going to be able to wreak havoc. The other thing is, for those of you familiar with Hayek's book, Denationalization of Money, Hayek talked about issuers of competing fiat monies, or private fiat monies that were irredeemable. Free banking hasn't got anything to do with that. That's a nice, interesting, hypothetical concept worth discussing and debating, but historically, free banking means banks are able to issue IOUs that are convertible into some established money. Banks have never historically been in the business of creating monies out of whole cloth, not competing banks. And so free banking isn't so radical as banks being able to come up with their own monetary units, change the existing monetary standard. That's not what these banks did. What they did is to supply very convenient substitutes and to create a system for self-regulating those substitutes that I've argued works, or can work, very well if you let it. Okay, I'm done. The floor is open for your questions. Yes, sir.
All right. So if I tried to advocate this to anyone, the first questions they would ask me would be, why did Scotland leave that system, and why did Canada leave that system? So
that is, of course, a very, very good question, and I'll try to answer it briefly in connection with those, and then more generally. In England, as a result of problems in the English system, the tendency was to feel that you needed to exercise more strict control on currency supply. But unfortunately, people did not get it. They did not understand that the problem in England was the central bank's monopoly of currency, or near monopoly, and instead they assumed that it was the residual note issuing rights, because there were some, there wasn't a perfect monopoly, of the banks in the countryside in England. And so what they decided was to totally cap the country bank's rights to issue notes, and also impose strict limits on the Bank of England with a rule limiting its issues. Well, these reforms helped, but they didn't really solve the problem in England. Nevertheless, they were thoughtlessly extended to Scotland in 1845. And what happened, therefore, was, as of that year, Scottish banks could no longer issue any more notes that weren't backed 100% by gold, beyond what they had outstanding in that year. And until recently, and perhaps still, the total note issues of the two remaining Scottish banks of issue are at the limit set by the Extension Appeals Act of 1845. They've never gone down. As Scottish banks merged, they lost, one of the merging banks would lose their note issue quota. And in that way, you ended up with this two banks with the two quotas for them set back then. There was no good reason in theory, but people did not understand that the danger isn't banks issuing notes. You don't get more expansion of notes by having lots of banks able to do it. The danger is monopoly. So having fewer banks issue notes doesn't make the supply of notes behave better. It makes it behave worse, because it's the checks and balances of banks imposed on each other that keeps every one of them in line. This just what people made the argument. There were great debates back then, but unfortunately they weren't persuasive. At least they weren't persuasive politically, and central banking won out in those debates. A wonderful book on this, The Rationale of Central Banking, by Vera Smith, who was actually Hayek's graduate student, talks all about this. In Canada, right, the story's more complicated. Canada adopted central banking in 1935, even though it had done a lot better with its non-central banking system up to that point than America had. The U.S. collapse of the money supply was 33%, in Canada 13% in the early 30s, and you have to remember that Canada lost a lot of gold during the crisis. It was a major trading partner of the U.S.